With DLC being so prevalent today, it's easy to forget that we weren't always so privileged. Before the internet provided us with an alternative content distribution method, if a game wanted to add content, rebalance things, or even just fix some bugs, they'd have to issue an entire new release. Sometimes it'd just be a revision in later print runs, or board revisions arcade operators had to install. But more often than not, these were full-on updated versions of games. Tired of Champion Edition Bison's dumb Psycho Crusher damage? Tough. You just had to hold that until hyper fighting made it less stupid. Of course, fighting games, perhaps more than any other genre, exercised this liberally, with Capcom in particular being the most well-known offender. But even aside from the big guns like Capcom, Sega, and SNK, there were some other fighting games out there that got updated often as well. But some of these updates, for various reasons, slipped through the cracks. Maybe it's because the update was region exclusive. Maybe it only released on a weird platform. Maybe the vanilla game was already kind of obscure to begin with. Or hell, maybe the update was so low-key that people don't even realize it's an update. Either way you cut it, there's some fighting game updates out there that don't get talked about much outside of the most hardcore fighting game sickos, and I wanted to talk about a few today. My only requirement for any of the games on the list is that it either had to add some tangible new content or rebalance things. If all it contained were just bug fixes, I'm not going to count it. Without any further ado, let's dive into things. Guilty Gear is a series whose popularity has finally reached something resembling mainstream popularity with the release of Guilty Gear Strive, but it's definitely been guilty, no pun intended, of numerous updates to past entries. It wasn't too bad for Xrd. Signed to Revelator is the only time you had to buy an all-new update. Rev 2 could either be bought standalone or as a DLC title update for Revelator. But the Guilty Gear X games? Oh boy. The current version of the game is Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus R, usually referred to as simply Plus R by most players. This update rebalanced the game, added some quality of life, added rollback netcode, and even had some move list additions, a lot of characters getting some sauce that was previously exclusive to the EX counterparts. Plus R, of course, was a 2012 update to Accent Core Plus, a 2008 update, and that was an update to Accent Core, a late 2006 update. And that was an update to XX/, a 2005 update, and so on. For real, there's like 2 or more for XX alone. But one of these Guilty Gear X-born updates is definitely more curious than others. Some of these updates exist to add new characters, rebalance things, or even reinstate characters that might have skipped a revision or two. But Guilty Gear X 1.5 is a special kind of curiosity. 1.5 released in arcades in 2003 and remained an arcade-exclusive revision, but its existence in general kind of fascinates me, because this actually came out after the release of Guilty Gear XX, which was the shiny new major release at the time. There's no new content added for the game. In fact, it's actually missing some of the content seen in the then 2-year-old PS2 update Guilty Gear X Plus. Some of that makes sense. 1.5 being an arcade release and all, it wouldn't really make much sense to have a story mode in there, especially with the way it works in the series. It does also lack Cliff and Justice, who were added to that version as well though. The interesting thing about 1.5 are the balance changes, because most of them are done in service of, well, making the affected characters play closer to their XX counterparts. This is just fascinating to me because you'd think the play would be to just focus on XX going forward, but taking an older revision and tweaking and re-releasing it to play closer to your new shiny release seems a bit counterproductive. Maybe there was a surplus of Atomic Wave hardware out there that needed to be utilized or something. I just can't think of too many times where a fighting game update is accompanied by a separate update to an older revision that has similarities to the new one. As I mentioned, some characters get the new moves they got in XX, so for example, Kai gets Greed Sever and Saul gets Fafnir and his Gunflame Feint. Dizzy also gets her triple jump changed to a double jump, and Chip gets his air taunt, among other additions. Are there any other fighting game updates out there like this where newer moves are backported into new versions of what are essentially older revisions? I'd really like to know. This one ran on Sammy's Atomic Wave board, which was largely just Dreamcast hardware with a cartridge-based storage medium, but remains arcade exclusive to this day, at least officially. Thanks to Dreamcast hardware being so similar to Atomic Wave boards, 1.5 was among many Atomic Wave games that received homebrew Dreamcast conversions that largely play great. It only works on Dreamcast emulators or with hardware mods that allow you to play games from an SD card though, so no burning CDRs for this one. Give it a try if you want to see one of Guilty Gear's weirder updates. Dim's Dragon Ball Z Budokai fighting games had me in a chokehold for most of the early to mid 2000s, and while the earlier ones don't hold up as well as the later ones, I still have fond memories of them altogether. Budokai 1 story mode and what if scenarios are still some of the most memorable single player content in the Dragon Ball Z game, and Budokai 2 was a step up visually and had some really neat stuff that still remains exclusive to that game, like unique boo absorptions and special non-canon fusions. The game that really made waves was 2004's Budokai 3. I know we've gotten and still continue to get a lot of really fantastic Dragon Ball games to this very day, but Budokai 3, and I don't say this lightly, was kind of a watershed moment for licensed anime games, at least as far as ones released worldwide. Not only was it a quantum leap over the first two entries in terms of combat, visuals, and content, but it was the first DBZ game to really feel like the series without too many compromises. Budokai 1 and 2 are okay for what they are, but feel like Dragon Ball Z flavored off-brand Tekken in a way. Budokai 3 is very much built on that same foundation, but there's so much love, attention to detail, and actual thought put into every facet of the game that elevates it into something far more unique and emblematic of the IP itself. This was one of the few fighting games back in middle and high school that I can actually convince my friends that aren't into the genre too much to run sets in. I know it looks kinda quaint these days, especially in the shadow of the excellent Dragon Ball FighterZ, but it really was one of those moments in time you really had to be there for to understand. Budokai 3 changed the game, for better or worse. Being such a popular game, Budokai 3, like the previous entries, found itself bestowed the title of a Greatest Hits game. Greatest Hits was a line of games on Sony platforms that reached a certain sales threshold and were reprinted and sold at a discounted price. On PS1, they were identified by their kinda garish green label, and on subsequent Sony platforms usually had a good amount of red implemented in its packaging. There's a handful of Greatest Hits games on the PS2 in particular, however, that aren't just budget reprints, but in fact brand new title updates with additional content. Some notable ones include Midnight Club 3, now christened Dub Edition Remix, Devil May Cry 3, now called Special Edition, Virtua Fighter 4 with the new subtitle of Evolution, and Budokai 3, which, well, actually has kind of a story behind it. See, the Budokai games were developed primarily with the West in mind, no doubt with the intent to capitalize on the series' astronomical popularity thanks to its then ongoing airings on Toonami. The games very uniquely released in PAL and North American regions first, with Japan usually getting them last, but with bug fixes and a Japanese voice track. Budokai 3 was no different. The Japanese release had, of course, the Japanese voice acting, a lot of visual changes made to the game both in fights and in the game's story mode Dragon Universe, and notably 3 new alternate costumes: Angel Halo Goku, Cell Saga Trunks, and Evil King Piccolo from the OG Dragon Ball, the latter even having some unique visuals for his moves. These changes were initially exclusive to the Japanese release of the game, which came out about a month after the rest of the world, but a few months later, PAL regions received a collector's edition of Budokai 3, which received all of the editions from the Japanese release but in English. Soon after, the license holder for Dragon Ball games in North America at the time, Atari, announced that Budokai 3 would soon be getting a Greatest Hits re-release, and that it'd be based off of the PAL region collector's edition and have all of the additional content. Outside of the Greatest Hits branding, this would also be denoted by a new box art, featuring Super Saiyan Goku and Vegeta dueling on the box art as opposed to the previous art of Super Saiyan Goku flying, fist outstretched towards the viewer, partially obscured in shadow. The Greatest Hits version released in the US, people bought it, and it was exactly the same as the original release. As it turns out, Atari screwed up and actually pressed the original base game into the discs that were supposed to be the Greatest Hits release. It got so bad that Atari had to actually set up a program where you could mail in your faulty Greatest Hits disc to them and they'd send you the correct version back in the mail. In time, stores would start carrying the corrected version, though for a lot of 2006 and 2007, it was still kind of a dice roll whether or not you had the proper release or the misprint if you picked them up new from a store. So what exactly does the Greatest Hits version have? So, as I've mentioned, there's the new costumes, the Japanese voice track, and the visuals being tidied up in a lot of places. Take Broly's story mode in Dragon Universe. In the base game, it looks like everyone else's story, but in the greatest hits version, the sky is red, lightning strikes in the background, and everything fittingly looks a lot more bleak. The characters in a lot of the menus have also been animated to have lip flaps for their lines as opposed to them just being static in the base game.
You can start a new game or load an old one. Which will it be? You can start a new game or load an old one. Which will it be?
The training menu now contains an expanded move list for the cast. Before, it just showed how to perform special moves and ultimates, but it now showed each and every character's unique melee string combinations, which is actually really useful. Though it's no Dragon Ball FighterZ, Budokai games actually have some depth to them, thanks to charge attacks in the game being able to be cancelled near instantly by tapping block while initiating a charge. This massively expands the combo routes for pretty much the entire cast, and is a really big part of the game's competitive meta, yes it has one, overall. Even a relative scrub like me can get some cancel combos going. And then you start mixing transformations and special moves with cancel points like Dragon Fist in? Oh hell yeah. Most interesting though is the fact that the game also kind of got a stealth rebalance. A lot of basic character strings were readjusted so that they either now don't allow for teleport chase follow-ups, or just straight up have gaps in them that allow the opponent to block or even interrupt strings now. Even more curiously, these changes specifically seem entirely localized to the North American Greatest Hits release. The European Collector's Edition, and presumably the Japanese release, don't have all of these changes. There's also some targeted character changes as well. Goku's Dragon Fist gets a nerf in that it doesn't build meter in the Greatest Hits version like it does in the base game. Note that doing the same combo leaves Goku with enough meter to transform into a Super Saiyan 2, as opposed to Greatest Hits, where he only has enough for Super Saiyan 1. And in the Budokai games, the higher your transformation, the more base damage you deal. Budokai 3 would later be remastered and ported to the PlayStation 3 and Xbox as the Budokai HD Collection, ported alongside Budokai 1. Though it's not explicitly advertised, this port is based primarily off of the Greatest Hits version, containing the additions and balance changes from that release. At least, most of them. For some bizarre reason, the expanded character move lists were removed from the game, instead defaulting back to the regular special move list from the vanilla release. Not sure why that was excised, but yeah. Also, the music has been changed pretty much throughout both games, but that has more to do with the plagiarism controversy that's way above this video's pay grade. Despite these changes, I still see the Greatest Hits and HD versions occasionally run for competition, but I think by and large, most people outside of that very specific circle probably don't know how different that version of the game is under the hood. Since we're talking about the PS2, let's talk about another company with a notable run on the platform, Square Enix. If you're a Square fan that played their stuff back then, particularly Final Fantasy or Kingdom Hearts, you probably remember when it seemed like every notable game in either series would get a super awesome Japanese exclusive Director's Cut re-release that added a shit ton of content and usually ended up being the definitive way to experience those games. Hell, the Kingdom Hearts Final Mix releases were the reason I learned how to play imports on my PS2 growing up. Times were tough for Squareheads out here. With DLC these days, they tend to incorporate the type of bonus content they used to reserve for these re-releases into DLC expansions instead, with Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition, Kingdom Hearts 3 Remind, and Final Fantasy VII Remake Integrate being some notable examples. That said, they were still doing these re-releases when it came to the PSP, though admittedly not as often. A lot of the time, the reason this would happen in the first place is because of the long lead times for English localization. It's easy to forget considering the shift to near day-and-date worldwide releases, but a lot of RPGs, and Square ones in particular, usually released months earlier in Japan than they would in the rest of the world. This extra time for localization would afford development teams more time to tweak and add to the game now that initial development was completed, and they could use the Japanese release and bugs and such found there as a reference for what to fix for the localized releases. Take Sephiroth in Kingdom Hearts 1 for example. Probably one of the most iconic optional super bosses in the medium, but for as recognizable and memorable as the fight is, a lot of people don't realize he was actually added specifically for the North American and PAL releases of the first game. In fact, of the 4 super bosses in that release, only one of them actually were in the original Japanese release. According to the series director and Square standby Tetsuya Nomura, by the time the development team started work on Sephiroth, the Japanese release was ready to ship, and all they had done was his character model. With the extra time they had for the localization, they added him, then 2 more super bosses for good measure. Of course, Japan would get a further expanded release of Kingdom Hearts 1 just 3 months later, subtitled Final Mix, which added all of the additional content in the localization, plus a new super boss, new abilities, and a truckload more. Okay, Seven, what the hell does this have to do with fighting games, you're probably thinking? And trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. I just wanted to establish some developmental context for the next entry in this list, Dissidia Final Fantasy Universal Tuning. Dissidia is an arena fighter Final Fantasy crossover on the PSP featuring heroes and villains from the first 12 numbered Final Fantasy games in a patchwork world of sorts fighting a proxy war between 2 gods. In typical Square fashion, shit is a lot more complex than that under the surface, but maybe I'll talk about that some other time. Dissidia, like most of Square's output at the time, released in Japan months before the rest of the world, releasing in Japan in late 2008 and the rest of the world in the summer of 2009. Because of that gap, the dev team took the time to make a few additions and balance changes to the localized release. Sephiroth notably gained a new HP attack, Heaven's Light, a fast rising uppercut with his oversized weapon. Squall also received a new Brave attack with these magic mines you can set in the air. Zidane lost the ability to chain his Brave attacks into one of his HP attacks, Free Energy. However, this was also balanced out by giving Zidane Free Energy as a basic HP attack that could be initiated at any time instead. There were also a handful of additional scenes in the story mode as well. Most notably, a new arcade mode was added to the game. This was a single player mode that allowed you to fight CPU opponents in an arcade style ladder with preset characters, as opposed to the characters you typically level up in story mode or versus matches. It made for a great pick up and play option for people that may not have wanted to fuss with the RPG leveling aspect of the game, and Square must have been proud of it, seeing as how it was the focus of the eventual demo release for the US and PAL regions. Just a few months later, Square released Dissidia Universal Tuning, though unlike a lot of the Japan exclusive re-releases, this one doesn't really add any new content over the international release. It's largely the English release of the game and all of its additions made available for the Japanese audience, though Japanese players could import their save data from the original Japanese release to transfer all of their progress. You also have the option for Japanese voice acting, though this only applies to the voices in battle. Cutscenes still use the English voice track. The only real changes in this version were balance changes, featuring even more than the localization implemented. For one, free air dashing speed was adjusted to match the speed of targeted air dashes. In the international release, they were actually a bit slower. EX canceling, some advanced tech that Gobez and Jet in particular could take advantage of, was completely removed. See, every character in Dissidia has an EX gauge which fills up during fights by collecting the little balls of light that scatter out of opponents during combat, and EX cores which bundle a bunch together. Fill it up and press R and square and you activate EX mode. EX mode is twofold. It's an install that gives every character access to their EX burst, a strong cinematic finisher move, but also gives each character some passive buffs while it's active. Also, most of the hero characters in particular equip their ultimate weapons from their respective game in this mode, and as a Final Fantasy nerd, I always thought that was sick. However, Jet and Gobez uniquely have moves initiated with the square button that can be charged, but also can be comboed into. Essentially, you hold square to charge up the move, but then tap R while holding it, which cancels the move but resets the character back to neutral while the opponent is still in hit stun, allowing for way further extended combos. Jet in particular, assuming you have the right equipment set up, a handle on his unique combo system, and the execution where EX cancels, can potentially hit touch of death combos. Here's a Gobez EX cancel in the North American release.
Creature of shadow.
And here's what happens if you try to do it in universal tuning. It's instead treated like every other move in the game, where going into EX mode won't cancel the move you're in the middle of. Also, and I'm kind of glad the Internet Archive can back me up on my memory of this, Universal Tuning's website actually listed balance changes for each character on the website, even with images for particularly notable changes. Considering that kind of thing still wasn't being done regularly on that level for even traditional fighting games back then, it's always kind of stuck out to me. The biggest defender by far was probably Zidane, who had several infinites with his Tempest move. Repeatedly dodge canceling in the right direction made it nigh inescapable unless the Zidane player screwed it up. This and a lot of other dodge cancels were taken away, so Zidane and a few other characters had to play a bit more honestly. Hilariously enough, Zidane's easiest infinite remained pretty much untouched though. So why is this version of the game relegated to an obscure footnote in Dissidia's existence? Well, a little over a year later, the game was superseded by its sequel, Dissidia 12. I've talked about Dissidia 12 a handful of times before, but it bears mentioning again just how much this game makes the first one in Universal Tuning obsolete. It contains nearly all of the balance changes from Universal Tuning, adds a new assist mechanic which does have a big impact on the combat, adds a new story mode with better dungeons and a new PS1 style explorable world map tying it all together, and if that wasn't enough, the entire story mode from the first game is unlockable in Dissidia 12, with all of the aforementioned additions, world map and dungeon improvements included. You can transfer over your character progress from the first game as well. Universal Tuning really isn't worth playing today, with 12 being so much better, but it's an update I thought was worth mentioning all the same. Tecmo is no stranger to the fighting game re-release pipeline. Take Dead or Alive 5 for example. You have the original release, Dead or Alive 5, Dead or Alive 5 Ultimate, Dead or Alive 5 Last Round, or hell, look at how many versions of Dead or Alive 2 are out there. This is something that goes back to even the first game, however. It started as a game on Sega's Model 2 arcade hardware, the same board that ran Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers, and thus received a pretty decent Sega Saturn port. The Sega Saturn port would down the line become the basis for the game's final console re-release as Dead or Alive Ultimate on the original Xbox. However, after the initial Sega Saturn port, Tecmo released a PS1 version of the game as well. This port looks and even functions a bit differently from the Saturn and Model 2 arcade version, no doubt due to having to use different hardware altogether. This port of the game also included Ayane and Bass as playable characters in the series for the first time and was also the first internationally released game in the series. Afterwards, Tecmo would port the PS1 version back into the arcades using the Sony ZN1 board, essentially a slightly souped up PS1. This somewhat lesser known revision was Dead or Alive++, releasing only in Japanese arcades. This update is interesting because it's very obviously Tecmo testing out mechanical ideas and concepts for the eventual sequel, so the game feels like something of a mishmash between both DOA 1 and DOA 2. A DOA 1.5 if you will. Right off the bat, the first thing to note is the addition of the critical state. This is a state you can put the opponent in with certain attacks that stun the opponent instead of outright knocking them down, allowing for follow-ups. The stunned defender can still use holds to defend themselves, but they're still at an offensive disadvantage, especially if they get launched. There's a limit to how many times a character can be put into a critical state though. This would go on to become a mainstay mechanic in the series. The most pronounced mechanical addition is for holds. Holds in earlier revisions of DOA 1 were pretty straightforward. Regular holds worked for highs and mids, and low holds were for low attacks. Think parries in Street Fighter 3. Dead or Alive++ instead goes for a tiered system where there are standard holds akin to what we'd see iterated on in Dead or Alive 2 and beyond. But then, there's an entirely separate hold system in place specifically for characters in a critical stun state, with 6 different holds, all with completely unique inputs meant to defend against specific types of attacks. This is easily the most complex hold system in the series, and it's easy to see why they would go on to streamline it in later entries, though they'd incorporate aspects of its implementation here and some other places down the line. The game also denotes these actions as well. Counter throws, critical holds, and critical stun are indicated in the UI when they happen. Previous games didn't have as much going on mechanically, so they had fewer UI pop-ups. Of all the fighting game updates we're covering in this video, this one's easily the most fascinating on the mechanical level. It's not all that often that we see big fighting games willing to publicly experiment like this in an iterative release, at least outside of location tests. Omega Mode in Ultra Street Fighter 4 actually ended up being something of a stealth testing ground for ideas that wouldn't be followed through on until Street Fighter 5, though that only became obvious in hindsight. It's neat to see fighting game designers work through ideas out in the open like that, though sadly Dead or Alive ++ would only release in Japanese arcades, and the only other way to play is via emulation, which is functional but not without the odd graphical hiccup here and there. Still though, if you want to try a version of DOA 1 that plays like a DOA 2 prototype, look no further. Alright, here's a couple other fighting game updates I wanted to highlight as some honorable mentions. Asuka 120% Burning Fest Return is a little known update for Asuka 120% Final, with some mechanical changes. It reverts some mechanics back to the limited revision, so no medium attacks or stun gauges here. From what I've been able to glean, it's generally not a very well regarded revision at all, with Final Unlimited seemingly being the more popular versions. I wanted to explore this one a bit more, but the main issue is that it's a Japanese PC exclusive from 1999, meaning it's a pain in the ass to get up and running on modern operating systems. Apparently, setting up a virtual machine in Windows XP and going from there seems to be how one would get it up and running today, but I couldn't get it done in time for the video. I also want to shout out Asuka 120% Limit Over. This one was actually an unofficial balance patch for Limited released by former members of the dev team that worked on Limited. Def Jam Fight for New York The Takeover is a 2006 PSP exclusive update to the fan favorite Def Jam Fight for New York on 6th gen consoles. Look, I know I'm stretching the definition of fighting games here, since it has a bit more in common with wrestling games, but Fight for New York has an active competitive scene, and wrestling games, if nothing else, are kind of the cousin of fighting games in some ways. Content-wise, there's actually a handful of cutbacks. 3 or so characters are missing, some stages only have 1 variant present as opposed to 2, and some music tracks were cut from the console release, presumably due to licensing. There are some entirely new stages made for the game's story mode though, which can also be unlocked for versus play as well, which is nice. Before fights start, you have a chance to get in a sucker punch on your opponent as well. They can do it to you too though. There's also a new mechanic where you can pummel grounded opponents. The person on the other end isn't completely defenseless. They can either reverse positions or stun the attacker by throwing dirt in their eye, depending on the stage. The fighting style system's also been expanded so that you can combine previously available styles to make new ones. You could combine styles in the previous versions of the game, but by and large, only the first one never had any bearing on how you fight in game. I really wanted to go into this game in a bit more detail, but music copyright on YouTube is tough, and that's all I have to say about that. Outlaws of the Lost Dynasty is a 1995 Data East arcade game. It's a 6-button weapons-based fighter, and it's okay. Not a train wreck or anything, I've certainly played worse. The game was ported to PlayStation and Sega Saturn the same year, getting some new stuff like additional moves for some of the characters on the roster. And because it isn't a Data East fighter without a guest character or two, the main dude from Fighter's history is an unlockable character. The following year, it'd get an updated re-release exclusive to Japan on the Sega Saturn, Suiko Enbu Fun Saiki. This one tightens up some of the stage backgrounds, retains the additional stuff added to the previous console ports, and adds another Fighter's History guest character. Honestly, I'd say maybe check this one out if you have the means. It's not gonna blow your mind or anything, or has any really unique mechanics going for it, but it's pretty solid and inoffensive overall. That's going to do it for this video. Are there any other obscure updates out there you think I missed? Feel free to let me know in the comments. As always, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.